Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this joint presentation by the Boston Public Library and the Museum of African American History. My name is David Leonard, president of the BPL and occasional moderator for several of our author talks and speaker series. Today, we are thrilled to have the winner of the Museum of African American History's Stone Book Awards with us for a brief presentation and brief conversation, which we will be getting to in a moment. But first, just a little housekeeping. We are recording today's program and we'll make it available through our mutual websites afterwards. So if you're watching us not live, thank you for joining us also. Today, we also have our partnership with a independent bookstore, and today's partner is bookshop.org, where you can purchase this particular work or other works by our guest. You can also check out the Museum of African American History and the BPL's collections as well. A few notes about the partner today. The Museum of African American History was founded in 1967, is New England's largest museum dedicated to preserving, conserving, and interpreting the contributions of African Americans. The museum has two locations, one on Beacon Hill in Boston and the other on Nantucket Island. The Stone Book Award was founded in 2017 in partnership with the James M. and Kathleen D. Stone Foundation, an annual prize that encourages scholarship and writing within the field of African American history and culture, and awards a $50,000 winning prize and two $10,000 finalist prizes to authors of exceptional adult nonfiction books written in a literary style published in the year prior. This is the award's fourth year, and the third year in a row that the winning author has given a talk at the Boston Public Library, albeit virtually. This is a partnership that the museum and the library look forward to continuing. In addition to our award winner, who I will introduce in a second, this year's finalists were also Walter Johnson for The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the United States, and Dan Royals for To Make the Wounded Whole, the African American Struggle Against HIV and AIDS. Both excellent works that we also recommend. To find out more information about these books and the award and the museum's program, you can check out social media, hashtag MAAH that's Museum of African American History Stone Book Award, and also by visiting their website at maahstonebookaward.org. And now to introduce today's presenter and speaker, the award winner, Professor Daphne A. Brooks, is the William Keenan Jr. Professor of African American Studies, American Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Music at Yale University. She is the author of Bodies in Dissent, Spectacular Performances of Race and Freedom, 1850 to 1910, winner of the Errol Hill Award for Outstanding Scholarship on African American Performance from ASTR, Jeff Buckley's Grace, and Liner Notes for the Revolution, the Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound, which is the subject of the award in our conversation today. She's also an award winner from multiple agencies, many published articles, and a frequent commentator, and her writing has been published in the New York Times, The Nation, The Guardian, and other press outlets. She is also currently editing an anthology called From Black Star Rising and the Purple Rain, celebrating the legacies of David Bowie and Prince, an international three-day conference and concert which she curated. And so without further ado, Professor Brooks, I would like to welcome you to the program and turn our virtual podium over to you for your initial presentation.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here in the round with you all today. as I did last evening, I want to take a quick moment to offer my deep thanks um, to the MAH Stone Book Award jurors for extending this honor to me. My great thanks to Leon Wilson, President and CEO of MAH, Jim and Kathy Stone, and the James and Kathleen D. Stone Foundation for generously and passionately championing African American Studies scholarship by way of this award, the Boston Public Library for hosting this event. I also want to acknowledge the extraordinary efforts of Pamela Waterman, something I meant to do last night. This is like that moment at the Oscars when the awardee neglects to thank someone crucial. Pamela Waterman, director of the MAH Stone Book Award, thank you for your tireless efforts and the excellence and care you bring to these moving and celebratory events. So I'm delighted to be in conversation with David Leonard today, and I've been asked to offer some brief remarks about my book before we chat, and I'm happy to do so. So a brief overview of Liner Notes for the Revolution, the intellectual life of Black feminist sound, and how it came to be. As I've now said in various contexts, when people ask me, what's this book about? I always like to start by asking this question. Think of a sweeping, comprehensive, decade-spanning history of Black women in popular music culture. This book is not that book. This book, my book, is the reason why you're probably having trouble coming up with the title. So it's in part a story of why that book hasn't been written, but crucially, it's also the story of what Black women musicians, as well as feminist thinkers and creatives who loved them, did in spite of this lack of full-scale intellectual interest in their work, what they did to look after their music, their groundbreaking performance practices and contributions to modern popular culture. It's the story of how feminist artists and intellectuals articulated the value of Black women's musicianship when other cultural institutions, critics, collectors, and other powerful gatekeepers showed little interest in affirming the depths and complexities of their aesthetic labor. One of the early guiding questions that I set out to answer when I first started working on this book was essentially this query, which on the surface seems like quite a simple question, but in my mind is anything but. And the question is this: if you were to point to a moment that marks the advent, the beginning of contemporary popular music culture, where would it be on the historical timeline? Now, old schoolers have asserted that it would be here, or here. And certainly we have revisionist historians who've reminded us that we probably want to look even further back in time to this moment and even here. But what happens if we tell the story of popular music culture as we've come to know and feel and experience it today by instead starting here with the catastrophe of 1619? And still more, what if we were to center the ideas and feelings, the observations and desires of the sisters who were the descendants of those in the hold of the slave ship, out in the field, confined to the kitchen? What if we actively kept that history front and center in our readings of Black women's musicianship across the centuries and took into account the socioeconomic, material, and psychic conditions that undergird Black women's artistry? How would that affect the nature of what we valued about their music, how we narrated their worth, how we interpreted the work of the music itself as an archive of historical memory, an archive of our affective relationship with historical memory, and as a multifaceted mode of both social critique and social intimacies? As I've lived with this project through the years, what became clearer and clearer to me is that the thing that I was ultimately after was shaped by centuries of violence, systemic iniquities, the enormity of chronic loss and marginalization, and how our writing about popular music culture might do a better job of capturing all of that. But as I indicated a moment ago, I was always determined to tell a story that was not just about all the young and old dudes, as I like to call them, carrying the news, some of whom, like the great Greil Marcus, for instance, call my friend and mentor. Some are collaborators and interlocutors. Some are critical sparring partners from who I spar with, who I continue to spar with even in their afterlives. We see Mac McCormick and John Fahey here. Folks who are not direct interlocutors of mine in their life on earth, but who I continue to wrestle with in terms of the body of work that they left behind. So I was determined, though, as well, to tell a story in this book that was equally about the nearly wholly overlooked history of Black women culture makers, performers and writers, activists, neighborhood folk, and family members, as well as allies who for well over a century now have been making their own meaning, producing knowledge about, and documenting their own desires for and intimacies with the music and cultural forms that mattered to them. So at its core, Liner Notes for the Revolution is the story of why and how Black women musicians across the 20th and 21st centuries have been and remain essential architects of popular music culture. It's a book about why these artists, from blues queens like Bessie Smith to superstar icons like Beyonce, fundamentally matter in the making of our modern world and how we navigate that world. It views them as artistic pathbreakers and innovators, as repositories of cultural memory, as bearers of complex and profound emotions, and of course as activist voices of vision and social change in the long Black freedom struggle. It also explores the reasons why these artists are both so passionately beloved and yet so often critically marginalized, disappeared from the historical record, or oversimplified with regards to their enormous cultural value and worth. So it's a book that's as much about criticism and record collecting and the men who've dominated these worlds as it is about the women and girls, the artists and critics and fans who valued Black women's music when others wouldn't. Throughout the book, I try to hold on to this truth, that the sisters are the absolute stars of this show. Women like Pauline Hopkins, arguably the first Black feminist cultural critic from the postbellum era. Zora Neale Hurston in her guise as a sound ethnographer and performer. Playwright Lorraine Hansberry in her guise as a queer Black feminist critic of modern culture. Janelle Monáe as an innovator of the liner note form. In the latter portion of the book, I turn my attention to the experimental performances and recordings of contemporary artists like Cecile McLaurin-Salvant, Valerie June, and Rhianna Giddens, who amount to, in my opinion, some of our boldest public historians. At its heart, this is a book that aims to celebrate and take seriously the radical intellectual culture of Black women's music. And so that's a brief overview of the book. And I'm so delighted to be in conversation with you today, David.
Thank you so much. I have not finished the book yet. It's quite impressive. It's right here next to me. But I feel like I'm discovering a world that I really knew. I know some of the characters, I know some of the music. I certainly didn't understand all the connections, and then discovering new people, and against a backdrop of, 400 years of history, as you shared in your opening slides, and even beyond, because I think this is the convergence of multiple traditions with history and roots in originary cultures that go back beyond the 400-year history and continue to have new influences coming. So I just want to start out with maybe why don't we focus on the title? Liner notes.
Yes.
Liner notes are in LPs, and they're the little descriptions. So tell us about how the title came about and what that means to you and why that's important.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I will say that originally it was a title that I'd been living with for a long time in relation to my research on Zora Neale Hurston, who, as I alluded to earlier, is one of the key figures in the book. And I had been reading, as a scholar of Black studies, her critical essays for quite some time. Most people are familiar with Zora Neale Hurston, especially um, folks who value the Boston Public Library. They're probably checking out Their Eyes Were Watching God, and really living inside of her Harlem Renaissance fiction. She was really a polymath, in the sense that in addition to being a novelist, she was also a playwright. She was also someone who worked on a WPA project during the New Deal to record the folk music of African Americans around the US as well as the broader global South in places like Haiti. So I started thinking about the ways that her essays about music and Black performance kind of accompanied those recordings. And then I started to make the connection in terms of form and themes that the albums that I grew up loving as a Gen Xer that had those liner notes essays, as you alluded to, David, these essays that originally in the mid 20th century appeared on the actual lining of vinyl records, and were produced by journalists. Early on, they were produced by the record labels. They were sort of this introductory text to whatever the recording was that you had on hand. But they evolved across the second half of the 20th century into some of the most virtuosic writing about music by some of the real heavyweights of jazz music criticism, folks like Leonard Feather and Nate Hentoff. I wrote a New York Times article earlier this year about the dearth of women writers who've been acknowledged for occupying the liner notes genre and winning Grammys for their liner notes. Joan Baez was the first to do that in the late 60s. But I decided that I wanted to think about that form as a way to both pay tribute to the women who are looking after in intellectual ways all of the musicians that I write about in my book. And so liner notes seemed like the best way to encapsulate this kind of intellectual revolution in terms of critical care about these musicians.
Because it's part introduction, it's part explication, and occasionally critique as well.
Yes.
Because I think I wasn't sure when I picked up the book first. Was I getting a history? Was I getting an expose of musicology? Was I getting stories, biographies of Black women musicians? And if I'm right, it's all of that.
All of the above.
So quite an achievement. How long has it been in gestation? How long were you working with this? Even maybe before formally writing it as a book, but there's just so much in here.
Yeah, no, thank you. In a way, I have said that I feel like I've been writing this my entire life. I am a native of the San Francisco Bay Area, so I have to have a moment of silence for the San Francisco Giants. I'm happy for the Red Sox, but this is a very painful day after for those of us who love the Giants, including my 95-year-old mom who's on the line. But that, okay, exactly, hi, Mom. But that regional affiliation is really important because many would argue that the birth of rock music criticism really its most robust gestation period was in the late 1960s, based in the San Francisco Bay Area. And if we even want to put a finer point on it, vis-a-vis some of the prodigious thinkers coming out of UC Berkeley. And I say that not only because it's my alma mater, but Jan Winter, who started Rolling Stone, came out of Berkeley. Grail Marcus, Ellen Willis, who's in my book, did graduate work at Berkeley. The list goes on and on. My immersion in that kind of culture, the kind of afterlives of psychedelic rock culture, and the intellectual work that was produced in response to that culture, really trickled down all the way to the Tower Records music store, where I would go on the weekends to find music criticism that could help me to make sense of this kind of foreign music, rock and roll, that lived outside of my household. I'm the youngest in a much older family. My parents escaped from the Jim Crow South in 1950, and my late father attended UC Berkeley, but they were jazz fans. I have much older siblings who were R&B fans, and along came rock and roll when I was going to integrated schools. And so that was the way that I moved towards thinking about music criticism as being very important to my own kind of cultural life worlds, but I didn't see myself in it. And so to answer your question, I think I'd been wrestling for many, many years with what it would mean to try to write a counter history that could account for all the things that I didn't see and feel in the journalism. Technically, I'll just say, to put a finer point on it, it took about a dozen years to write this book. So
I think we both, for perhaps different reasons, perhaps shared reasons, are in the business of uplifting voices that are sometimes left out of our stories and our histories. And how difficult was this to research? Because it's multi-genre and multidisciplinary, and also turning to periods where not all of these voices might have been well documented.
Yes, thank you for that question. I am an archive geek. I'm even teaching a grad class right now at Yale in conjunction with our storied manuscript, rare book and manuscript library, the Beinecke Library here on campus. And that class is called The Archive, This Blackness, the Archive, and the Speculative, the Beautiful Struggle. And I'm encouraging and trying to guide my grad students towards asking questions about archival figures from history, for whom we have very little material, and how do we creatively kind of think about honoring what they left behind and what is elusive to us. That's certainly something that's modeled by one of my intellectual heroes and many people's, Toni Morrison, in her book Beloved. She took a snippet of news of a news periodical from the 19th century about Margaret Garner and the tragedy of her subjugation and slavery, and turned it into her masterpiece novel about that historical moment. So this is a way of saying that I've always been kind of curious about how to wrestle with archival material that is both available to me, and the questions that lie behind not being able to always apprehend those figures that, for all sorts of reasons based upon intersectional power and subjugation, we have trouble knowing from our historical past. I've visited probably about a dozen different archives. I will say that some of my favorite ones that were incredibly moving would be the Schomburg Center for Black Research, storied New York Public Library in Harlem, holds Lorraine Hansberry's papers. There are over 60 boxes of her, her intellectual life worlds. She kept everything, as did her husband, Robert Nemiroff, really documenting her own notes on her feelings about culture that mattered to her. Rosetta Reitz is another figure who appears in this book. Many people don't know her, but she was a second wave Jewish feminist culture worker and historian who started her own record label after she began listening to blues women's recordings, classic blues women's recordings like Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey, when she was going through menopause. And then she couldn't find more of the recordings, and thought to herself, why is it that we have so little access to blues women's recordings and their history, but we know so much about, other icons like Robert Johnson, who had a huge resurgence of interest in Robert Johnson in the 1960s. So her collection of notes and papers and the liner notes she wrote about the recordings that she reissued are housed at Duke University, and there are over 80 boxes. So that just gives you an idea of the kinds of research materials that I was dealing with in this book.
Is there one or two stories that come quickly to mind about surprising discoveries? I'll leave it to you to pick one that fits that description, but it could be something that you really didn't think or just blew you away, or I don't know what would you like to share that would meet that question?
Thank you for that question. Well, I will say three very quick examples. One is, well, two actually. One is that Lorraine Hansberry and Ellen Willis, as I write about in chapter 4 of the book, were surprisingly linked to one another in a passing way. Ellen Willis, the late, great rock music critic, second wave feminist as well, was the first music critic for the New Yorker magazine, Jewish New Yorker, white woman, grew up loving rock and roll. When she went to Barnard College, she had an internship at Mademoiselle magazine and pursued an interview with Lorraine Hansberry, who, of course, we know as being this iconic playwright who wrote Raisin in the Sun and was experiencing a kind of unprecedented celebrity as a Black writer, along with one of her best friends, James Baldwin, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. There is a clipping of Ellen Willis's interview with Lorraine Hansberry, in which there's a photograph of the two of them looking at each other. And it was that photograph which really set me to thinking about the connections between Black feminist cultural criticism and the kind of rock and roll music criticism that Ellen Willis became so deeply devoted to once her career, got underway in the late 1960s. The other example that I would give is of Rosetta Reitz, who I mentioned as well. She's actually, she was fascinating to me in terms of her notes because she actually collected art reviews from Time magazine and then would strike out various words and almost use them as a kind of a template for coming up with her own unique language for writing about the value of blues women's music. So there's a way in which, these kinds of archival moments give us a peek into the experimentations of these thinkers and these creatives and how they were working so hard at trying to care for the music and to communicate to the world that this music matters and should be addressed and valued by cultural institutions on a variety of different levels.
Right. I mean, I think what you're also moving to there is that this is a discovery of the intentionality of many of these artists, musicians, commentators who are trying to bring a message through. So I want to have you talk a little bit about the subtitle, because this is also the story of that work and that process and that goal, the intellectual life, Black feminist sound.
Yes. Thank you for that question, David. I really appreciate it. And, I think that through the years as I've been writing this book, the thing that I've tried to emphasize to my students, to my colleagues, is that being able to assign a kind of a framework in which to understand how music matters to folks in marginalized communities is so powerful, because culture is one of the most potent ways in which we value the full humanity of individuals, in our modern world, right? And the fact that there's such a distance between the kinds of institutional value that we see assigned to great works of art, in the West across time, versus those works of art and modes of cultural expressiveness that have really, transformed the ways that we live our lives, by folks in the margins, and especially African American women. That's a kind of phenomenon and a distinction that I really wanted to tease out. And so when I refer to this kind of phenomenon as intellectual life, it's to, hopefully acknowledge the kind of the depth and the scale of thought and rigor and care that's gone into engaging with this cultural work that again has transformed how we sort of negotiate our feelings on a day-to-day basis. To give a very quick example, if we think about the ways that Aretha Franklin was able to carry the gospel melisma, that kind of compressed articulation of many, many notes in a single syllable, something we now call, kids would call runs, vocal runs, it's the wallpaper of our popular lives now that we hear in popular music, a kind of vocalizing that, is just standard with that melisma. And that melisma carries so much in terms of its expressions of feelings, of sorrow, of joy, of pleasure. Aretha Franklin broke through the airwaves and carried that kind of sound from Black vernacular religious spaces to the global popular domain. And so that's the kind of example of the powerful impact of Black women's musicianship that I'm identifying in this book. That level of influence has not been matched in terms of a kind of mainstream intellectual valuing of its significance. And so trying to mend that bridge was one of the key goals that this book took on.
So aesthetically, do you see any contrast between thinking of a work or a piece as beautiful in an objective sense, if we can use that word for a moment, versus seeing something as expression of culture, experience, history, pain, joy? Maybe those aren't opposites at all, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the aesthetics of this experience that you're uncovering, given the musicians and artists that you're describing.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I hope I'm tracking on what you're specifically asking me. But in terms of aesthetics, I guess that I'm trying to hold a space in this book for thinking about the work of aesthetics in our broad social and cultural lives, and the kinds of aesthetics that these Black women musicians have innovated and have been interpolated into our wide cultural framework in which we navigate the world. So paying attention to that, and really then trying to think about what it means to produce narratives about cultural worth, that's been largely considered to be and presumed to be a white male domain. But the musicians themselves, as well as women writers and thinkers, have been producing this kind of work on their own to identify, the significance of a Mary Lou Williams, a jazz genius, who I write about in the book, to really think through the value of what African-American everyday laborers were doing with Black music, and writing about that so as to clarify the impact of their work. That's what Zora Neale Hurston was doing. So I've tried to kind of run the book on two axes of both the musical power, right, and worth of these artists, and then the commensurate power of the thinkers to be able to account for all of that in their written prose.
Yeah, it's beautiful in its own right, but perhaps it's also beautiful because it is expression of cultural moment and experience.
Yes, absolutely.
That's what I'm inelegantly trying to.
Oh no, not at all. That's
for our listeners. For
appreciate
those of
that.
you listening live, we do want to take a couple of questions from you. So I'll keep going for a little bit, but I'm happy to take questions. So if you do have a question, please pop it in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens in Zoom, and we'll do our best to get through all of those. Professor, was this a work of joy, of pain, of discovery? how difficult or how joyful was it to write and do this work?
Thank you for that question. It was all of the above. The richness of your questions alludes to the complexity of what I was trying to capture here. I would say the joy always comes for me in writing about and alongside of music. I use that last formulation very pointedly because many years ago, actually almost 20 years ago, was asked to participate in a conference session curated by the poet Joshua Clover, Grail Marcus, and Ann Powers, another rock critic hero of mine, and other folk were in this session. Professor Clover called it critical karaoke, and the idea was that you had to pick your own song that at some point in your life you felt very passionately about. You could adore it, you could have, actually found it quite repulsive, but the idea was to compress all of those feelings and a narrative about the song into the space of the length of the song itself, and to deliver your remarks set to the song. It could not be any longer than the song itself. And that was one of the most important writing exercises that, I was ever assigned. It changed my writing forever. And I will say that, I find that, almost all of the musical objects that I'm wrestling with in this book, I am writing towards and alongside of in that kind of critical karaoke mode. I'm trying to be at the center of the music in terms of experiencing it and drawing my reader into that experience as well. Painful, yes, because the story of Black life in America is a painful one. In all sorts of ways and in all sorts of affective registers. And I wanted to be able to hold a space for that as well, especially in the second half of the book. The book is divided like an album into a side A and a side B. And in that second half of the book, I'm really trying to think through and address the ways in which a cluster of critics have had very complicated feelings about these two really prodigious blues women musicians about whom we know very little. And the reasons why we know very little about them have everything to do with Jim Crow segregation, anti-Black violence, misogyny. Those kinds of points don't often come up in the writing that's been produced about them. And so I try to take seriously what it would mean to try to write about that history, as opposed to trying to know everything that we possibly can about those musicians who have disappeared from the historical record from a variety of reasons that we may or may not ever know.
Would you mind shedding a little light for us on when you're approaching particular musicians or their work? Do you start with the lyrics? Do you start with the musicology and the choice of style, whether that be jazz or blues, or how do you navigate the lyrical and non-lyrical in this analysis?
Wow, that's a great question. In my travels this year with this book, I have not gotten that question. I love it. It always varies. It depends on the kind of recording or the kind of performance that I'm writing about. For instance, in the last chapter of the book, before the epilogue, the very last set of performances and body of work that I'm exploring comes from the MacArthur Fellow jazz musician, the great Cécile McLaurin-Salvant. I write about a concert that I attended of hers in 2017 at Jazz at Lincoln Center, in which she performed Jelly Roll Morton's Murder Ballad. For folks who are not deeply immersed in blues history, it's one of the most profane and one of the longest blues songs ever recorded. It's over 30 minutes long. And the late storied folk music ethnographer Alan Lomax, a mentee and also adversary in some ways of Zora Neale Hurston, a legend. He recorded Jelly Roll Morton's Murder Ballad for the Library of Congress shortly before Jelly Roll Morton passed away. When Cécile McLaurin-Salvant performed that song, which is kind of it's graphic in terms of its violence, it's racial violence, it's sexual violence, it's an incarceration story, it's a queer blues women's love story, and as I suggested, it is riddled with profanity from beginning to end. and it's 30 minutes long. There are also no recordings that I had access to of this performance when I was writing the book. So I was writing from memory, and I was writing, um, I chose to enter into writing about that performance on multiple planes. I was writing about what I could recall with regards to the deeply nuanced vocal intonations, which are absolutely virtuosic, of Cecile McLaurin-Salvant, how she interpreted every single line, every single word, every single verse of Morden's recording, and reinterpreted it really from, I argue in the book, a Black feminist perspective. But I was also writing about the reactions of the audience, which ranged from pearl clutching to silence, to a kind of antiphonal relationship with certain moments in the song. I was writing about her ensemble of performers accompanying her, how they moved alongside her instrumentally at key moments in the text. So it's always a multifaceted endeavor, and it depends on what the recording, what the performance is asking of me. I think of it, how to respond, how to meet the performance of the recording on its own playing field. It varies.
Just before we take a couple of questions that have come in, I want to ask about this current moment in the United States history and where we are. And, particularly after the killing of George Floyd and many other events that many of us knew had been happening for a long time, but for which we had new awareness of late. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how your work in this book contributes to, at least among some people, an openness and willingness to learn more at this time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. There were two things that I thought about deeply as I was finishing this book in the summer of 2020. I had the proofs, everything had been written. Pretty much the only thing left were the acknowledgments and an author's note, which comes at the beginning of the book. In the author's note, I had decided, much to the chagrin of folks working with my proofs, that I wanted to commit to capitalizing Black, something that I had done all through my undergraduate years as a Black Studies major. When I was in graduate school in the 90s, there was a shift to moving to a lowercase Black for a lot of reasons. I'm looking at the time. If people want to ask me about that, I can get into that.
Yeah.
But I decided that I wanted to revert back to a capital B. And there are a lot of cultural institutions who wrestled with that in a very public way. The New York Times, for instance, the Washington Post. My reasons went back to the 19th century, and I have a longtime mentor, P. Gabrielle Forman, who writes about 19th century African-American literature. And in her own book, Activist Sentiments, had her own author's note that began with an allusion to T. Thomas Fortune, who was a crucial Black editor from the postbellum years, who announced to his readers that I am a proper noun, and that is why I'm using a capital B for Black. And for me, it felt like the most important statement that I could make in the context of 2020 to acknowledge the full worth and humanity of every single individual of African descent who moved through the arc of the narrative in this book. I wanted to be able to produce a study that could call attention to the foundations of our life in the West, having been radically and forever transformed by people who were deemed less than human for a long portion of our country's history, and to think about those tensions between what it would take for this country to acknowledge the full humanity, the proper nounness of Black people, by way of paying attention to the mammoth contributions of culture that African-American peoples have bestowed on the United States. So that's what I guess I would say, is how I would hope people would continue to think about why this book may be of importance to them, as a way to be reminded of the country that we live in as being forever changed and transformed aesthetically, but also deeply, at the heart of our feelings, how we feel the world, by folks who were once defined as commodities and not people.
And sometimes music gives us a medium to access who we are in each other's experiences without some of the baggage of spoken history and spoken words, difficult and important as though those are to acknowledge as well.
Yes.
Um, let's take a couple of questions from the audience, which are maybe a little bit of your personal relation on your personal relationship to music. The first question is, which came first, your love of writing or your love of music? And they ask a follow-up as well, which is, how does your research affect the way you experience new music today?
Great questions. This is such a pleasure. Wow, I almost think my mother should answer those questions about, but I've I fell in love with writing at a very early age. I fell in love with the idea of criticism at a weirdly early age. As a Gen Xer, I grew up watching Siskel and Ebert's at the movies, which came on right after the Muppet Show on PBS in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so there was a gateway drug for me to sort of think about, the pleasure that I got out of culture and being able to find myself and my relationship to culture through writing itself. But even before that, I understood writing to be so central to Black liberation projects. And like any person my age, in certain social spaces, grew up writing for Martin Luther King Jr., essay prizes when I was in school. I just always had a deep appreciation of what writing could do in terms of self-making and also, Black radical liberation projects. Um, and then, the role that music plays in relation to my research, that's also a great question. I think, as someone who, as I alluded to earlier, grew up with a love of record stores and found myself spending way too much time in record stores. UC Berkeley once historically had many record stores on its, landmark Telegraph Avenue. That's the gateway to the university's campus. To the extent that record stores became places for me to explore and to become curious about all of the different material aspects of music culture, I think there was always a kind of way that research and sound worked in tandem for me. Be it staring at the cover of an album by an artist unfamiliar to me and trying to dig for some contextual life about that recording, to hearing sounds on the radio and, pre our technological platforms, having to go to the Menlo Park Public Library and, look up who Duke Ellington was. So I think it's always been there.
I think while the internet and music distribution via technology offers us so much greater access for some people, at least, if not for everybody yet, the loss of the ability to just browse through a record store is, yes, there are, thank God, some independent ones around still, but I think that's a loss for our culture in some ways, or at least an evolution that has pros and cons to it. The next question I'd love to take is, and maybe I can riff a little bit on what the person is asking. They've asked, which song or artist was your favorite to write about? And I'm wondering if there's an early 20th century one and a contemporary answer to this as well. Maybe there's two answers to this question.
Oh, there are multiple answers, but thank you for that. So an early 20th century, figure I get great joy, in writing about and writing alongside of is Mamie Smith. She was the first African-American woman to record the blues. And I say that because I write about this in the book. I've written about this in the New York Times. Many people don't know that blues recordings were first made by white Americans who happened to hear the blues music of African Americans and decided to record it for themselves. Record labels were hesitant to permit African Americans to record the blues themselves for a whole host of anti-Black reasons that I could get into if people would like to do that. But Mamie Smith recorded Crazy Blues in 1920, and I can listen to that record again and again and again because of the ways that she draws on her skills as a vaudeville performer to inhabit so many different personas. And you really have to pay attention to the nuances of what she's doing from one lyric to the next. This is also a recording that comes on the heels of the 1919 Red Summer racial massacres that spread across the country that year, many years in the wake of World War I and the return home of African-American soldiers to a country that still violently disenfranchised them. So that recording holds so much history. It's an honor and a pleasure and deeply moving and galvanizing to listen to it. At the other end of the century, I mentioned Cecile McLaurin Salvant. So I will say that I always still love living inside of her music for reasons that are similar to Mamie Smith, that she is able to inhabit so many different personas in such formidable ways as a vocalist. But I also loved being able to write about Beyonce's Lemonade for the epilogue, in part because that album is an archive of history. It's a visual and sonic endeavor that is holding space to think about not just the catastrophe of Hurricane Katrina, but the 400 years before Hurricane Katrina that informed the level of chaos and pain and suffering that we saw unfolding at the dawn of this century. And so I think of it as one of our most extraordinary albums, not just of this century, but the past century. And it's a pleasure to be able to write about that record.
You've reminded me of a project that the library is involved in with the Internet Archive, which is housed in San Francisco, actually. And this was a project to digitize the great 78s of the early part of the 20th century. We'll see if we can get the link shared with people while we're still chatting. But it would be fascinating, I think, to look and see how many of the people that you're referencing, and if they are indeed the early recordings, such as the one you just mentioned, there may indeed be some of those gems available for everybody to listen to now that they've gone beyond copyright. So great project to a great organization.
Wonderful. Thank you for that.
Last question that I have queued up so far from our audience. Can take one or two more if they're out there. You made a reference to karaoke early on, and the questioner is asking, which song did you pick for karaoke? I'm not sure if that was reference to the specific reference or if that's just a general maybe question that you have a go-to song for karaoke.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mentioned critical karaoke as being that all-important writing exercise, and the song that I chose was a song by the Bay Area rock band Journey. I did not grow up as a huge fan of Journey's, although weirdly in my professional life now, I did do an event with the lead singer of Journey recently and was able to tell him for a second time about this writing exercise from 20 years ago. The first time I told him about it was when I was in the process of writing the piece. It was for the song Lights, which is about the San Francisco Bay Area. And this was a year after my father had passed away in 2004. And I was trying to capture the feeling of coming into consciousness as a proud Bay Area resident, but also being the child of parents who were from Arkansas and Texas, as I mentioned, who escaped the Jim Crow South in 1950. And the summers that we would spend in the South becoming a way for me to kind of understand who I was, at a distance from the Bay Area in this foreign place. So I was writing about that song, my affection for the Bay Area, and also the history of the Bay Area in the 1970s as I was coming of age, everything from Patty Hearst to the Jonestown Massacre to psychedelic rock. It was just a kind of a cornucopia of electrifying and also troubling and spectacular and charged ways of post 68 way cultural landscapes. So I was writing about that in relation to the song, and then my mother and I went to the ballpark, the Giants again, and we saw the lead singer of Journey right as I was in the days that I was finishing the piece, and I talked to him about it. So that ended up in the song as well, or I'm sorry, in Critical Karaoke as well. So that is the piece that I wrote about. It's published in a couple of different places, including the Black Clock Literary Journal from CalArts. It's called Critical Karaoke.
Just a final question from me before we ask you to maybe do a little reading of a piece from the work. I think we've talked about centering the voices and work of Black women artists throughout the book, but we also find gems about the dominant male, mostly white musicians of the periods that you're looking at. Indeed, the epilogue takes us from a little Bob Dylan reference through to Beyonce's Lemonade. So maybe just a final comment on how fun it is to put those juxtapositions together as well.
I love it. I mean, I'm a Dylan fan, and I often get asked to speak about Dylan. I co-wrote a piece with my colleague Gail Wald called "Women Doing Dylan," women covering Dylan. And I felt that juxtaposition was important because, as I mentioned, my hero Grail Marcus has written so beautifully about Bob Dylan's relationship to the long history of American cultural imaginaries, and that's so central to his sort of the folkloric element of his body of work. What I wanted to do is pay attention to the ways in which that kind of long folkloric history of a cultural imaginary is very much manifested in Lemonade as well. And if we put Dylan's basement tapes in conversation with the actual landscape of the basement that Beyonce occupies for much of the time in Lemonade in ways that people had yet to address, I felt fully, that was an important endeavor that I wanted to take on to close the book out.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation so far. I'm looking forward to picking the book back up and learning more about the characters, the history, the thoughts, and the voices. Can I invite you to close us out with a little reading and some introduction?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David. And so that I always like to have images to accompany my writing. This is the passage that the first couple of paragraphs that open the book. So I'm really happy to share them with you today.
Sure.
Quiet as it's kept, Black women of sound have a secret. Theirs is a history unfolding on other frequencies, while the world adores them and yet mishears them, celebrates them and yet ignores them, heralds them and simultaneously devalues them. Theirs is a history that is nonetheless populated with revolutionaries. Turn of the century vaudevillian Muriel Ringgold rocking her entirety in full costume as the sea. Blues trailblazer Mamie Smith breaking the era of modern records wide open, all crazy and Staggerly style love. Opera ingenue Anne Brown rewriting Best to Gershwin's Porgy. High Priestess Nina orchestrating a Brechtenfeld tempest aimed at overturning Jim Crow. And slinky Afro-cosmopolitan Eartha Kitt staging her own geopolitical cabaret. It's a history wide enough to encompass rebel with her own cause, rock and roller Etta James in a fast car out on the open road, and folk historian Odetta going deep into scholar, thinker, rule breaker, Zora's precious vault so that the real work songs can begin. It's teen Aretha in shimmering sequins attacking Al Jolson's Swanee, and those glam ambassadors, the Supremes, pointing us towards somewhere one day after a king had been slain. It's the body and soul of a grown-ass musician building bridges over troubled water for her listeners, the electric kinetics of Anna Mae Bullock breaking free from domestic tyranny, funk philosopher Betty Davis inventing her own erotic lexicon, and intergalactic trio LaBelle, rest in peace Sarah Dash, delivering Afrofuturist theory all up in the club. Theirs is a history of the utopic and the transformative, the strange and the strategically unruly. Diana reaching out and touching the hands of the multitudes in the Central Park rain. Afro-punk godmother Grace driving Atlantic World nightlife right to the edge while polystyrene and skin work on burning the whole house down. It's Whitney's melisma lighting up post-civil rights America, and it's Ms. Hill with her renegade contralto scoring 1,000 turn-of-the-century sorrow songs for the hip-hop generation. It's a hard-working H-Town New Millennium storm system performing radical Black pop feminism to fight catastrophe, and it's her avant-garde genius Baby Sis staging a blackest of black uprising right in the center of the lily-white Guggenheim. Theirs is a history of game-changing art that stands as affirmation of our past as well as the unrecorded future of sound, that which is booming in the not yet, the place where all those sisters of the Yam are running us straight into the dawn. Liner Notes for the Revolution tells the story of how Black women musicians have made the modern world. It is the first extensive archival interrogation of what ethnomusicologist Christopher Small has famously referred to as the musicking extending in all directions in our world, made by women who have been overlooked or underappreciated, misread, and sometimes lazily mythologized, underestimated, and sometimes entirely disregarded, and above all else, perpetually under-theorized by generations of critics for much of the last 100 years. Black women's music practices are, in short, revolutionary because they are inextricably linked to the matter of Black life. Their strategies of performance perpetually and inventively philosophize the prodigiousness of its scope. But also, and quite crucially, to wrap up, Black women's musical practices are revolutionary because of the ways in which said practices both forecast and execute the viability and potentiality of Black life. Thank you.
Professor Books, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your work, your research. Thank you for being in conversation. And congratulations once again on being the finalist and award winner of the Museum of African American History's Stone Book Award for 2021.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you.
And now, please be aware that this book is available from bookshop.org, also from a library or independent bookstore near you, wherever you may be. We have 2 slides with some upcoming talks, both from the Boston Public Library, and you can see the next 3 installations that we are highlighting there on the slide, and also some upcoming events from our friends and colleagues at the Museum of African American History. Again, please keep an eye on both of our websites for more information and more programs. Thank you once again to our colleagues and friends at the museum and to the staff of the Boston Public Library. Thank you for joining us live. Thank you for joining us in recorded form. Wherever you are, please be safe, be well. See you next time.